It's Tuesday, August 5th, 2025, and Tropical Storm Dexter has officially formed. And here on the National Hurricane Center website, we can see Tropical Storm Dexter has officially formed off the eastern coast of the U.S. Now, luckily, this is expected to only be a fish storm and continue to travel out into the Atlantic before it becomes a post-tropical system. Now, our biggest area of probability after this is actually going to be out here in the main development region. Currently has a 50% chance of development, but the likelihood of this impacting the United States in the future, probably 2 weeks, is actually looking pretty slim. I still think our risk area right off the coast of the southeast is actually going to be our area to watch. Now, currently it only has a 30% chance of formation listed by the National Hurricane Center, so it's still only something to not really worry about, but definitely something to be weather aware about. And this could pretty much impact anywhere from north of Cape Canaveral all the way up to Cape Cod. So the area is definitely very large and pretty uncertain at this point if it were to form. And there's also a risk of severe weather today, with our greatest risk being out here in the Dakotas with an associated marginal risk of severe weather. Then there could also be some strong swaths of storms down here in the southeast. Now, this threat of severe weather is going to be mostly wind driven, with the greatest risk of seeing some 60-mile-an-hour gusts being within our slight risk area. Then there's just the conditional threat of some 60-mile-an-hour gusts pretty much anywhere in that 5% risk area or marginal risk area. And our hail risk covers pretty much the same exact area, and this would just be the conditional threat of seeing some hail in excess of 1 to 1.5 inches in diameter. And there's actually a pretty large conditional tornado risk, which spans most of our slight risk area as well. And once again, it's going to be pretty nice, feels good temperatures for a lot of the US, anywhere between the mid 70s to mid 80s, although we're going to start to see a warming trend out here in the Great Plains at most today. We're going to see some high 90s feels like temperatures. Then back in our Gulf Coast and Texas area, there's just going to be a lot of widespread mid 90s to low hundreds feels like temperatures today as well. And the highest risk of flash flooding today is once again going to be in the southeast, centered over Georgia, parts of southeastern Alabama, and even into parts of western South Carolina. In this slight risk, there is the conditional threat of anywhere between 2 to 4 inches of rain today. Then in our marginal risk, we have one up here in the northern plains, another one in the Ohio River Valley, then associated southeastern risk area. We could see anywhere between 1 to 2 inches of rain in all of those areas today. And here's what the radar could look like today in our northern plains risk area. And we're going to see that a lot of our storm activity today is going to be driven by a storm complex from yesterday. And as this pushes off as a mesoscale convective vortex, it could actually see some redevelopment in the early morning hours and pretty much all the way through the morning hours into nightfall. Within this risk area out here in the Dakotas and Northern Plains, there is going to be that conditional threat of some 60-mile-an-hour wind gust and pretty small hail, probably not over 1 inch in diameter. Then also the conditional threat of tornadoes, because we do have some nice shear vectors which are actually somewhat parallel to our line, which could cause some pockets of vorticity and thus a couple of spin-up tornadoes. Although, as we can see, our mode actually looks like it's going to be pretty messy, and this little tongue of precip in front of our line could actually hinder the environment quite substantially. So that's why it's going to be just a very conditional risk out here. But we're going to see that that risk is going to be mostly up here in North Dakota and will last all the way into the evening hours. Now, a couple areas which I do think could see a heightened risk of severe weather would potentially be an area developed along the outflow of this storm, along when the low-level jet kicks in. I do think this would actually be where the highest tornado risk would be if this model solution does come to fruition, because it's also going to be when the low-level jet kicks in. I also do think we could see some potentially larger hail with this, although it's expected to be pretty linear, and the environment would likely be hindered because the storm mode also looks to be pretty messy out here. I wouldn't be surprised to see some hail in the 1.5 inch to 2 inch in diameter range. I also wouldn't be surprised to see some damaging gusts in the 60 to 65 mile an hour range. And then also it does look like there could potentially be the formation of a low pressure system down here in southeastern South Dakota, also along some frontal activity, it appears. And with this cluster of supercells, I do think we actually could see some pretty strong damaging gusts, even up to 70 miles an hour and even potentially some large hail in excess of 2 inches. But that cluster would likely die off pretty quickly. And then our main area of focus would be our storm cluster back here, developed by some outflow, which would actually turn into a bit of a mesoscale convective vortex, which would also pose a threat for all hazards into the night today and would likely push eastward into parts of Minnesota, but it would likely lose all of its severe characteristics by Wednesday morning. And here are 500 millibar winds, and we can see that the main culprit for our severe weather today is going to be a short wave digging in across the Dakotas, which is going to help to initiate and organize our storm cluster and just keep it lasting for that quite long period of time like we are expecting. Then there's just going to be a lot of flow sort of backing up that, and also that possibly a short wave down here in southeastern South Dakota to also help initiate that cluster down there as well. Then we also have a high pressure system in the southwest, which is going to help to pinch some of our flow, further enhancing it, and also bring some extra organizing shear to our storms. And here's what our environment is going to look like in front of that line of storms out here in the Dakotas today. And we can see that our hodograph is actually going to be somewhat curved, and we're going to have some nice low level shear and low level listy. That is why there is going to be that conditional spin up tornado threat with that line. And then our bulk shear isn't going to be terrible. This says 27 knots, but I wouldn't be surprised to see closer to that 30 to 35 knot range, definitely keeping it organized and having some more severe characteristics for longer. This is also going to be coupled with some weak wind veering, further amplifying that, but we do see some stable air and a bit of capping because of that precip band, which would be in front of our line, which would actually stabilize that quite a bit, which would hinder pretty much all hazards today and would actually make that risk a lot more conditional and smaller, but that lowest cloud level would be low enough to further support a tornado risk. Then our mid-level lapse rates aren't going to be super poor, and there is some cape up here in our freezing level, so that is why there is that conditional threat for some hail. But the main thing is that it's going to be fairly moist for this area and also modestly unstable at around 2,000 cape. And then the 3 cape in this region could be anywhere between 50 to 100. So another reason why that threat of severe weather is just going to be pretty much there, although it's going to be pretty conditional for all hazards today. And here is a weather sounding from that cluster of supercells in southeastern South Dakota, which would be initiated in the late afternoon hours, and even per our cluster developed by some outflow in parts of northeastern South Dakota. This would be more likely what our weather soundings would look like, with a bit more of a straight hodograph, although our shear would get better the further north we go. And then we actually see quite a bit of dry air aloft, a big bit of cape up here in our freezing level, big mid-level lapse rates, and then we also see quite a bit more organizing shear at around 40 knots. So that tornado threat would be not as large, but that threat of seeing some hail and isolated damaging gust would be quite a bit more substantial. We also have a very low relative humidity, which would help with evaporative cooling. And then we also see a pretty high downdraft cape of 1,700. That's actually very high. So another reason why I do think we could see some isolated damaging gust with our cluster of supercells expected in southeastern South Dakota, and even some more higher risk with our storms up here in northeastern South Dakota. But there's also going to be a pretty moist environment and a pretty unstable environment, 65 dew point, 3,500 cape. So I definitely just think as we go into the night hours, and I do also think that our South Dakota storms would actually bring a greater threat for some severe weather.